We all need to make smart decisions with our money. The Long-Term Investor podcast shows you how by distilling complex financial matters into easily digestible lessons. And now, here's your host, Chief Investment Officer at PlanCorp and the author of Making Money Simple, Peter Lazaroff.
Welcome back to The Long-Term Investor. In this episode, I am so excited to be joined by Dr. Elizabeth Dunn, a professor at the University of British Columbia and one of the world's leading researchers on happiness. Liz's earlier book, Happy Money, has had an outsized influence on how I think about personal finance, and her work really is the one that sort of helped me recognize that mathematically optimal decisions are not always the happiness optimal decisions, and that good financial planning should account for both. Her new book, Leave the Lights On, applies that same lens to spending, commuting, work, travel, investing, and some of life's biggest decisions. So I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation that we have here. As always, there are detailed show notes at thelongterminvestor.com, where you can also sign up for my newsletter that comes out every other week and has access to exclusive content and downloads that you can't get anywhere else. And now here is my conversation with Liz Dunn. Welcome back to The Long-Term Investor. I'm very excited to have with me Dr. Elizabeth Dunn. Liz, thanks so much for joining the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I have wanted to have you on for a very long time. Your prior book, Happy Money, is one of my favorite. It's something that I gift all the time. And you have a new book out called Leave the Lights On. We're going to get into both of those, but maybe you can just start by giving the audience a little background on who you are.
So I'm a professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and I am a happiness researcher. So I have a pretty fun job, which is to figure out what makes people happy. And I've applied this lens to thinking about resources like money, time, carbon emissions, technology, and my students and I conduct experiments to find the answers that we're curious to know.
You know, I was really excited to have you on. Your work actually influenced a lot of what was in my first book, Making Money Simple. It influences the way that I think through client discussions, friends and family, even the decisions that my wife and I make around our kids and our family. Happiness is so wide-spanning. I guess when we think about how it reacts to things that could maybe make the planet better, make our lives better, what I don't want to do is lose the audience on, hey, this is all about environmentalism. This is a really wide-ranging topic. So I thought it might be kind of fun to start with maybe you can just dispel some myths for those people who are always making you feel guilty about doing X, Y, or Z because it's bad for the environment. Maybe you could point to some of the myths that exist, and maybe we could make people a little happier if they choose to ignore some of those myths.
Yeah, so I have definitely experienced those myths firsthand. So actually, when I first moved to Vancouver, I moved here with my boyfriend. He was a passionate advocate for climate change, which I really appreciated. But if I happened to wander out of a room without turning all the lights off, he would shoot me this withering look like, why do you hate the earth? And so, that kind of feeling of like guilt and shame actually made me want to keep my distance from the climate movement. But since working on this topic, I've actually learned that I could leave all the lights on in my 2-bedroom condo for the rest of my life. And the carbon emissions would actually be equivalent to eating 13 hamburgers. So many of the things that we feel guilty about doing or that we scold other people just don't matter that much. And so our goal was really to figure out what actions truly have an impact. And just as importantly, which of those actions would actually make our lives better, make us happier?
I love that. There's an example in the book I also really liked about people who will carry around cotton reusable bags. And I actually use reusable grocery bags. And I do it thinking, okay, I'm doing something a little helpful, but I also just like that I can fit more groceries in a reusable bag than I can. But I think you said something like you had to use the reusable organically grown cotton bag like 150 times before you've actually made a difference. And there's so many things, maybe some of it's virtual signaling, maybe some of it really is with good intent, but that was what was so fun about the book is there is a lot of these things that if you've ever felt guilty about the way that you are impacting the environment, there was a lot of good visuals and comparisons there. And you mentioned also, okay, this topic took some interest moving to Vancouver with your boyfriend, but I mean, transition from happy money, where it's very financially focused, to this, like what was that bridge? Was it as simple as, hey, I'm living with a environmentally conscious partner here?
Yeah, so I really cared about climate change, but as a happiness researcher, I honestly thought I did not have anything valuable to say about it. But I was biking to work one day and, thinking about climate change. And it occurred to me that I actually ride my bike to work because I arrive in a better mood. So I'm nicer to my colleagues. I'm happier having just gotten some fresh air and exercise than if I battle traffic in my car. Of course, biking is also one of the most sustainable forms of transportation. And then it dawned on me that, in fact, so many of the things that we need to do to tackle climate change are actually good for our happiness. And I'm lucky enough that one of my colleagues at UBC is one of the world's leading experts on the behavioral side of climate change. So I shared this idea with her. And she says she had a real light bulb moment where she realized that happiness was actually missing in the conversation about climate change. There's so much doom and gloom and shame and fear and anxiety. And, negative emotions have their place, but actually positive emotions are really important too. So that's when we teamed up and started thinking about this project and thinking, okay, how can we help people get happier and get, lower carbon footprints at the same time?
I love that. And, I hear echoes of both of the books that you've now published. I think of those kind of trade-offs the same way with money, where like, hey, this answer in a spreadsheet matters, but the real goal that you're trying to get to is a better, more fulfilling life. I want to dig into a couple of the concepts, and probably a lot of what I might ask you is more on the money-related side than the environmental side. However, I just bring on the climate stuff because I think people are going to really find it enlightening. Again, one of my favorite parts of the book is the distinction between buying status and buying comfort. And you use the language type A and type B purchases. So can you explain to me a little of why that distinction matters and what it does for happiness?
Yeah, so there's this idea that some purchases, which we could call type A purchases or comfort purchases, are sort of fundamental to us as humans. So the sort of prototypical example might be like an air conditioner. An air conditioner is going to make you more comfortable in your home. And, you don't need to do a whole lot of social comparison to know that it feels better to be in a room that's, 70 degrees than a room that's 95 degrees. In contrast, though, there are many other purchases that we make, which we might call type B or status purchases, that we value and we might even enjoy, but they're very different. We really need some social comparison information in order to appreciate them. So you might think of a fancy designer bag or, some extra nice cars, things where, we really have to know what other people have. A diamond is a prototypical example where how awesome your diamond is kind of depends on, is it bigger than other people's? In contrast, being in a room that's 70 degrees is inherently pleasant relative to being in a room that's 95 degrees. You don't need to be looking over your shoulder to see what somebody else has in order to value it. And I think this is a really interesting distinction, because if we focus on these type A purchases, things like, having an air conditioner, having the right temperature in our home, that's something that can potentially make us happier. And if we sort of increase the access to these kinds of purchases for everybody, that can raise everybody's happiness. In contrast, you give everybody bigger diamonds. Well, now my diamond isn't so good. I need an even bigger diamond. It's sort of an eternal rat race. And so I think these type A purchases are really interesting. And they're potentially relevant when we think about climate change. We might want to think about consuming some of those type B purchases a little bit less, because in essence, they're not sort of fundamental to who we are as humans. So they're sort of a great opportunity to cut back on some of our consumption. In contrast, though, and this is maybe a little bit of a break with what some folks in the climate movement would say, we would suggest, don't sacrifice those type A purchases. So, temperature matters. Your home should be a comfortable temperature, but maybe you can live without the extra large diamond. And so if we're trying to maximize our happiness while living more sustainable lives, I think this distinction between type A versus type B purchases can help us decide what sorts of things to prioritize and what to let go.
Yeah, and a lot of what I noticed there, both in your response and in the book itself, is that the goal is not necessarily just spend less everywhere, but just stop overspending in those low happiness categories, something that's really been pervasive in all of your work. Another thing that you kind of talk about is the buy fewer but buy better argument. As somebody who has a closet full of clothes then doesn't really know what to do with them, I'll tell you, I was reading through the chapter, I'm like, I really should do this. Maybe share some of the thoughts that you have on that space.
Yeah. So first off, just from a climate perspective, just to sort of frame why I got interested in this here is fast fashion has an outsized impact on climate change. In fact, I was pretty stunned to learn that a single pair of jeans basically ends up emitting more carbon than a new iPhone. So the clothing decisions that we make are really consequential. Again, though, I'm a happiness researcher. I want people to enjoy the things that they buy. But there's a really great opportunity here to buy less, but buy better by buying high quality things, but not too much of them. So really thinking carefully about the wardrobe that you want to have, having those, some people call it a capsule wardrobe, like some key pieces that go well with other things. Then you don't need a closet stuffed full of a million different pairs of jeans. You have a few nice pairs, maybe in a few colors that go well with the other things that you own. And again, this is really a different sort of approach to spending that I think is maybe the default in our culture where, fast fashion kind of pushes us to want to buy things all the time, just buy that latest thing, stuff it into our closet, whatever. And instead, this is about saying, maybe I'll put actually a little bit more money, like even be willing to spend more than I otherwise would to get something that's really, really high quality, really classic, that's going to last and isn't going to be out of fashion in 3 months.
When I was reading the manuscript, I was in the midst of like a 3-city, 7-day trip that was mixing work and personal. And those are tough trips. If you're like a business traveler or work traveler of any kind, those are like tough trips to pack for, because the difference between like I was in New York, I was in San Diego, I was in the Midwest, like those are all very different needs. And I'm thinking about what you're talking about, like how can we have these things that are simpler and just like dress up the same thing a little bit differently each and every place, really hit me in the moment. So side point entirely, but felt like I should just share that in the moment as I was reading. A big thing in the book, I think maybe one of my favorite studies that I came across within it, centered on generosity, which was a huge part of what I gleaned from your book, Happy Money, that when you're being generous with your money, that's something that shows prolonged happiness versus spending it on yourself. Not always, but in many cases. Can you talk a little bit about the TED mystery experiment that you discussed within the book, though?
Yeah. So in some of our earlier work, we had shown that when people are given a small amount of money, like $5, $20 to spend on others, they end up happier than when they're given that same amount of money and told to spend it on themselves. But of course, we were always working with these, pretty trivial amounts of money, like $20. And so we wondered, would generosity produce so much happiness if people were spending really consequential amounts of money? And we just figured this was something we were never going to be able to test because of the limits of research grants. And then one day I got a call from Chris Anderson, who's the head of TED. And he said, Liz, we've got this opportunity where there's a wealthy couple in the TED community that wants to give away $10,000 to each of 200 people across a bunch of countries. Is this something you would be interested in studying? And I was like, oh yeah, count me in for sure. And thus began what we called the TED mystery experiment. So we called it the mystery experiment because we didn't want people to know that they might get a huge bundle of cash if they signed up. But those who signed up and qualified did receive, in fact, it was not a scam. They really did receive $10,000 all at once. And the cool thing about this study too is that we were able to recruit people from around the world, including people in places like Kenya and Indonesia, where $10,000 was really a life-changing amount of money for some of our participants. Now, in this study, partly because of the donors' wishes, we didn't tell people how they had to spend the money. Instead, we let them make their own choices. But every time they spent any of the money, they had to tell us what they bought and how it made them feel. So basically, what we discovered was that just like in our earlier research, people seem to get the biggest happiness boost from using money in generous ways. Specifically, the number one biggest happiness boost actually came from donating to charity. And this was particularly striking to me because people did all kinds of great things with the money. They, took a family trip to Disney World. They bought a new iPhone, invested in education, bought a car, like all kinds of great stuff. And yet, even in this, very high consequence spending situation, we saw generous spending rising to the top.
Now, was that surprising to you, or did that, like, going in, you're doling out the money, you probably had some expectations or hypotheses of what you thought would happen? Like, how different was that from what you were expecting to see?
I mean, as a scientist, I really hoped that we would replicate what we had seen earlier, but I honestly didn't know because, again, I can totally see the argument that, like, oh, sure, it feels great to give away $20, but would it really feel good to give away thousands of dollars? And yet, that is indeed what we found. The other part that was definitely surprising to me was just how much of the money people chose to spend on others. So people spent over $1,000 of the money just on charitable donations on average, and over $6,000 in all kinds of different, generous pro-social forms of spending. So things like buying gifts for other people. So that was actually quite remarkable to me, and a much more dramatic show of generosity than I honestly expected to observe, even as somebody who has studied generosity for over a decade.
Yeah, very cool stuff. I really enjoyed reading about that. Another kind of realm of happiness research that you've done that I've enjoyed following over the years and is also addressed within the newest book is things around like housing and commutes. And when I talk about how your work has influenced the way that I coach clients or just have conversations with friends and family, commute is one of the bigger things that I've been like, look, they're like going through this where me and my wife live. We are right next to our kids' school. Like, we're about equidistant from each other's works. Mine's a little closer. The only thing that's actually inconvenient is what we do with our dog. But, that, we have the biggest dog you could possibly have. So that's inconvenient enough. Tell me a little bit about the commute piece, like what the trade-offs people are experiencing and what your research has shown there.
Yeah, so the minutes that people spend commuting each day tend to be among the least enjoyable moments of their day. So anything we can do to cut back on commuting is likely to be a boon for happiness. And interestingly, commuting is also responsible for a huge portion of the typical American's carbon emissions. So commuting is a problem for climate change. Commuting is a problem for happiness. So this is a real sweet spot, an opportunity to make a change that's going to make us happier and make us live more sustainable lives. And so, when it comes to cutting back on commuting, one thing is just, as you said, to kind of think about where you live, like be really strategic in terms of where you live. And I think often people focus on really salient features like, oh, that house had such beautiful marble countertops or high ceilings, or, oh, there's an extra guest bedroom that's so nice. But they lose sight of the sort of more abstract feature of like, how much time am I going to spend in my car if I buy or rent this house? And I think that should be the number one question people ask themselves. Now, not everybody has the luxury to move closer to work. And so if that's the case, then you can think about, all right, you're stuck commuting. Can you do anything to make this commute more enjoyable and more environmentally sustainable? And there, if you have the option to bike. So I feel very fortunate in Vancouver. We have great bike lanes. It's very safe and, feasible to bike. And so biking seems to be a real sweet spot. For example, some research shows that Americans who bike regularly have fewer days of poor mental health per month. So biking is a really nice intervention for our well-being and also incredibly low carbon. Even e-biking is great. So e-biking, very low carbon. And it turns out, interestingly, people who own electronic bikes get just as much exercise on average as those who own regular bikes. And the reason is that they just end up biking more. You can get so many places so easily. In fact, most distances that people drive on a typical day can be easily covered on an e-bike. So I think this is a really exciting time where this, technological innovation is making it so much easier and more accessible to bike. So biking's great. If you can't bike, like let's say you're stuck driving, Then I would say, the good old-fashioned carpool, I believe, is very underrated. So we know commuting tends to be this unhappy time of day, but socializing tends to be one of the most enjoyable activities in most people's day. So if you can actually find a way to carpool, maybe with, a friend or family member who you're not getting enough time with, or just somebody like you can get matched with through an app, who might live in your area and have a similar kind of commute. And then you kind of get to know this person, and suddenly your time spent alone in the car is time that you get to catch up with somebody and have an interesting conversation.
Well, Liz, if our CFO is listening to this conversation, he is my neighbor, and we have only carpooled maybe once or twice in the 12 years I've been at Plain Corp. So we are not following along with the research. What I am following along with the research is that I work from home a lot. Pre-pandemic, working remotely was not an option for everybody, and not necessarily an option for everybody today, but certainly more prevalent. And I'd have to think it's much better to work from home than commuting, but it seemed like the research was a little bit more nuanced. Can you talk about that some?
Yeah, I find the work from home research super interesting. I mean, so first off, just to sort of set the stage, if you could work remotely 100% of the time, that would dramatically cut your carbon emissions relative to driving to work every day. So that's a huge potential opportunity. And ideally, it gives you so much time back that it can increase your feelings of time affluence, of feeling like you have enough time to do the things that are important to you, which should lift happiness. So remote work has this sort of really strong potential to increase both happiness and increase sustainability. But it does seem to be a problem, which is that there's some evidence, and many people may have experienced this firsthand. There's some evidence that when people work remotely all the time, they end up feeling a bit lonely and isolated, particularly if they, maybe live alone. They're spending all day alone, perhaps interacting with their colleagues, over Zoom, but it isn't the same. And so interestingly, what the conclusion we're seeing kind of emerge from various studies is that perhaps there's a kind of sweet spot of working from home kind of 2 or 3 days a week and going into the office on those other days. So you're still going to really cut your carbon by not going into work every single day. You're going to lift your time affluence, but you're still getting that feeling of connection that comes from actually being with our colleagues in person. Now, when people, especially leaders, are thinking about applying this advice, I think it's so important to think carefully about the goals you're trying to achieve. So nobody should have to commute for an hour to then sit in a cubicle on Zoom for 8 hours. It just makes no sense. And so if we're bringing people into work, we really want to think about harnessing everybody being there in person together to do the kinds of activities that work best when we are all in person, to really use it as an opportunity to build connection. And to me, this is one of the most interesting areas of emerging work and something that I've been really enjoying talking to business leaders about.
Well, that's fascinating. And a lot of what you share resonates with me, at least anecdotally. One thing that I definitely want to touch on that again has had tremendous impact in the way that I frame decisions, that while there's like the correct answer in a spreadsheet, there's also like the better answer that, allows you to ignore the spreadsheet from time to time. And that's experiences. I feel like the millennial generation as a whole has really leaned into this idea that like experiences over just normal expenses can create a lot more happiness. I would love for you to just touch on that research broadly first before like narrowing down, travel is one of the biggest ways that people will look towards the experience category. When you write a book on climate impact, it can kind of complicate things, but maybe you can paint some broad strokes background on the research on why experiences drive greater happiness. And then maybe you can narrow the focus on travel specifically and what you shared within the book.
Yeah, so in my first book, Happy Money, we have a whole chapter entitled Buy Experiences, where we review a bunch of research showing that people seem to get more happiness from buying experiences like vacations, special meals, concerts, World Cup games, than from buying material things like, couches, cell phones, clothing. And this is certainly a mantra that I live by. I definitely invest in buying experiences. I just paid the unbelievable amount of money to take my 13-year-old son to a World Cup game.
Awesome.
But it was hard to justify in a way, but also so amazing. And I'm so glad we did it. And really, like, he loves soccer. He lives for it. So it was a very special experience for us to share together, and something we'll always remember, I think, much more so than if I bought him, the other things that he would be interested in having, the material things. So I'm a big believer in buying experiences. But of course, as someone who's just written a book on climate change, I'm very aware that flying in particular can come with a really high carbon price tag. Now, that said, I, again, am a happiness researcher, and I don't want to suggest people shouldn't go on vacation. But I do think there's a really interesting opportunity here to have very enjoyable vacations that don't cost a lot of money and don't emit a lot of carbon. And so that's what I really dug into in researching this new book. So one of my favorite studies on this topic was actually done by a Dutch researcher who went around to various kinds of tourist attractions, surveying tourists. And what he wanted to do was figure out what kinds of tourist activities made people the happiest. So was it eating or shopping or going to a museum? What really made tourists feel happy? And at first glance, what his results suggest is it kind of doesn't matter. Like, when you're being a tourist, you're sort of having a good time, and the eating's fun, the shopping's fun, the museum's fun. It's all great. The one exception was when people had spent most of that day traveling, they didn't feel so good. So it's really the travel part of tourism that undermines our enjoyment. So what this means then is there's an opportunity to think about, maybe taking trips closer to home in order to minimize the time we spend on travel, thereby cutting back on our carbon emissions and allowing us to enjoy all of those tourist experiences without being dragged down by the, misfortunes that often come with travel. So, to me, I've tried to apply this by thinking about making time to be a tourist in my own hometown or just in my own region of the country. I know when COVID hit and we couldn't go very far, I actually got to appreciate some of the really wonderful attractions that are in my own region of the Pacific Northwest. Now, again, that doesn't mean never go to Europe, never go on a really big trip. But I think, consider it a treat, something to do maybe once every 4 years, like the Olympics, and instead of going to, if you have the luxury of being able to go off to Paris for a week every summer, instead, could you go for 4 weeks and see more of France, travel by train, really get, deep into the culture and the food and immerse yourself in it and really make the most of that flight? So I tend to think about return on emissions. Can you get the most possible amount of joy for every pound of carbon that you burn?
Now, I'm going to risk maybe repeating some of what you said or eliciting a response from you that repeats some of what you said. But one of the things that strikes me as I watch clients, as I look at my own life, friends, family, whatnot, where people will use travel as a way to compensate for a daily life that doesn't bring them a lot of joy. How do we avoid using travel that way?
This is so interesting. I mean, this is where I think maybe, if people are not enjoying their daily lives and maybe making a lot of sacrifices and then really splurging on travel, that might not be the best route to happiness and definitely not the best route to carbon and to saving carbon. In fact, it turns out that somebody who eats vegan all year long, but then flies from New York City to Thailand for Christmas will end up with the same carbon footprint as someone who ate meat all year, but just stayed home for the holidays. So I would say investing in some of those, daily life pleasures rather than trying to stick all your money and all your hope for happiness into that massive trip at the end of the year.
That's shocking. And the book does so much of that, dispelling, if you think this is really making a difference, do look at that. So many ways. And again, the happiness part is huge within it. I want to pivot a little bit more to an investment specific question. You talk a little bit about some of the impact, and this is really relevant for anyone who is an ESG investor, which I'm broadly using the term. Maybe I should be calling them a socially responsible investor. But how banking and 401ks and shareholder voting can really end up at a different place than you might expect. Like, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I think when people think about money and climate change, they tend to focus, a lot of people tend to focus on things like what you buy. But it turns out that what you buy matters much less than where you stash your money. So just to start at the most basic level, most people have at least a savings account, right? Turns out that having $1,000 in a typical US bank generates about as much carbon as taking a flight from New York to Seattle. And the reason for this is that most big US banks are heavily invested in the fossil fuel industry. And so you're essentially investing your money in the fossil fuel industry without even intending to. So just taking one Saturday to move your money is actually a very powerful strategy. As a happiness researcher, I will admit, probably not the most enjoyable thing you could do with your Saturday. But unlike, food choices or commuting, you do it once and you have just made a massive difference. Okay, so that's kind of at the lowest level for everybody who just has a savings account. When it comes to investing, I mean, there are just so many incredible opportunities now to make a difference through the investments that you make. And, obviously, I'm not an investment expert, but one of the people that I spoke to that really just blew me away was the founder of a company called Sphere. And Sphere is really interesting because they basically create 401ks, but without the fossil fuels. So very, very similar to what you kind of 401k you would get anywhere else, but just minus all of the fossil fuels. And so I think this is really important that just by, thinking about where to put our 401k, we can potentially have a huge impact. And, I would worry much less about things like exactly what, how much meat you eat or where you flew than where you're keeping your money. If you have a lot of money, where you put that money is probably the most impactful decision you could possibly make in terms of climate change.
Probably pretty surprising to people, particularly when you think about the savings account. If this is something that's really important to you, again, just another way where you can uncover this sort of thing. And it's a balance. You have a chapter on these big life decisions, like where to live, whether to have kids or pets. All this stuff can be really emotionally loaded topics. I guess, what do you wish that people understood when you're discussing these big items, without turning them into moral debates?
Yeah, I don't think we need to make it a moral debate at all. And in fact, I think moralizing over climate change is actually counterproductive because it kind of knocks out the nuance. And I think we need to make more calculated decisions, almost the way we would with investments, when it comes to thinking about reducing our carbon emissions. So, for example, when we think about having kids, some people have probably seen these headlines that if you care about climate change, you shouldn't have children. I think that is a crazy conclusion. After all, we want our species to survive, so we need to have kids. And having children can be a wonderful and rewarding part of life. But, it's worth thinking, okay, on the margins, maybe how many kids to have. That's where I think climate change, we can start to think about this. And there seems to be, we probably need, 1 or 2 kids, kind of replacement purposes. 5 kids, I don't know, then you're starting to have maybe a bigger carbon impact. But okay, let's just say you want to have a big family. You want to have 5 kids. Not my jam, but if that's what you want to do, great. Then you could, but let's say you really care about climate change. Then what you want to do is see, could you live in a place with clean energy? So, for example, Vermont has very clean energy. And so living in a place like Vermont, you can have a really low carbon lifestyle, even with a big family. So again, there's so many opportunities to live the life that we want to lead while keeping our carbon footprint low. And so in the book, what we really try to do is not tell people, oh, here are the 5 things that everybody needs to do in order to cut carbon. That's not our approach at all. Instead, it's to help people understand the actual science, which is so different from the sort of listicle approach that we see a lot out there, and say, okay, given this, what decisions can you make that work well for your own life in order to maximize your happiness and minimize your carbon?
I love the way you frame that. I want to bring this to a close with the last chapter. It's called Upward Spirals of Joy, which to me sounds a lot like compounding. So I guess, what do you feel like climate action or really any behavior change has in common with long-term investing?
I think there's a lot in common. I think, just doing a little bit can make a big difference, and starting early is awesome. And what I think is really interesting with behavior change is that when we change what we do, we can end up influencing other people in ways that we might never imagine or even recognize. So one of my favorite studies on this was actually done right on our campus at UBC by some friends of mine. And what they did was to observe diners standing in line at a simple cafeteria. There was just a meat option and a vegetarian option. And they just unobtrusively watched what people ordered. And it turned out that people ordered the exact same dish as the random stranger in front of them in line 72% of the time. So what this means is your simple choice to, place a vegetarian order rather than ordering the beef or whatever, can influence the other people around you in ways you might not even notice.
I love that. Herding 101 right there. And I lied. Actually, I want to ask you one more question. After somebody listens to this episode, what is the first decision you would think they ought to revisit?
Well, again, I think it depends so much on the individual. So I don't want people to all go out and do the same thing. Again, that's the sort of listicle approach that I think I would love to see us get away from. And instead, what I'd love for people to do is, rather than doing one specific behavior because they heard it on a podcast and now they think they need to go, eat a salad or recycle or something.
Unless that behavior is go buy your book. But yes, go on.
Right. Go buy my book. Then you'll be all set. I'll be happy forever. No, instead, I'd like them to ask themselves a question, which is, where are the opportunities in your life to increase your happiness and cut carbon? So just even identifying one area. Is it in food? Maybe you're somebody who eats a lot of beef and perhaps you could cut back a little bit. Or is it in your commute? Like maybe you have a long commute that you could potentially rethink. Or is it about remote work? Is it about the vacations that you have coming up? Or maybe something more along the lines of voting and civic action. And again, just starting with an area and thinking, where do I want to do that makeover? And again, our book is organized around each of these domains of life. So people don't even have to, I know reading a whole book these days is a lot for people. So we've intentionally designed it so people can just skip to the chapter that works for their own life. I think with this podcast, they've had enough of an introduction to this sort of big idea, which is, hey, we can actually enhance our happiness while cutting down on carbon. And then just pick the area that you want to focus in, zero in on that, and start making those changes. And what I would really love for people to do, if we're getting into my wish book here, is I would love for people to, get together with others that want to make changes in their lives too, because it's so much easier to make change in our lives when we have social support, when we have other people doing it along with us. And so that would be, if I can make like if you're the genie, Peter, and you can give me a magic wish, that would be it.
I love it. Well, Liz, this was my magic wish. This is such a pleasure to have you on the show. If people want to follow along with you and see what you're doing more in the moment, what's a great way to find you?
So our website is happyclimate.org. And there's lots of interesting resources, news, updates. They can join our community. And I'd love for people to be part of it.
Great stuff. Again, Liz, thanks so much for joining us on The Long-Term Investor. For those of you watching on Cheddar, be sure to subscribe on YouTube or on the podcast channel. Wherever you get your podcasts, you'll hear these interviews first. And again, Liz, thanks for joining us. We will see you all next time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Long-Term Investor Podcast. To access free financial resources and submit questions to be answered on the show, visit thelongterminvestor.com. Peter Lazaroff is an employee of PlanCorp and BrightPlan. All opinions expressed by Peter and any podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of PlanCorp or BrightPlan. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Clients of PlanCorp and BrightPlan may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.